Hello again, this is my video on political participation. Question for you guys. Does democratic rule become more legitimate the more people vote? Legitimacy here means simply the right to rule. That is to say, do democracies have the right to rule more the more people vote? I think the answer to this question is going to depend on the different views one might have of democratic legitimacy. Democracies could be legitimate on one account because it does what people want it to do. The people, after all, rule in a democracy. Democracy could be legitimate also, and this is a different view, because democracy does what's in the people's interests, regardless of what they say. On this view, democracy treats everybody's interests more or less equally, and that's what makes democracy legitimate. Finally, we could argue that democracy is legitimate because people in a democracy actually exercise political control over their officials, right? It's not just that democracy happens to mirror what people want or happens to do what in people's interests, but it's that democracy actually provides a link between the people and what happens in government. On the first two views, it's just not clear that more turnout, that is to say more people voting, makes things more legitimate. For example, a random sample of 100,000 voters could easily mirror the desires of the population down to a fraction of a percentage point. We could govern by polls, in other words, and we could forego the expensive and tiresome process of electoral campaigning and voting. Why not just do some good polls, and we could easily have the government act based on what the people want. Now, you guys haven't read Kaplan, but there's some evidence that people sometimes systematically vote against their own best economic interests. And if that's true, then more turnout may actually make things worse, because as you've seen, the people who vote tend to be better educated, have more information, and so on and so forth. On that view, of course, the more people vote, then the less democracy is legitimate. But that seems paradoxical. Now, on this third view, where people must actually exercise political power, on that view it seems that exercising turnout is desirable. In fact, full legitimacy of a democracy would require everybody to vote. You might think about making voting mandatory and giving people fines if they don't vote. This is often the case in countries like Australia, where voting is mandatory. As we know, political participation, though, is not just about voting, although we tend to associate participation in voting quite closely in a democracy. What else might count as political participation? Well, writing or contacting your representatives, attending rallies or political protests, attending the meetings of political organizations, writing to newspapers, magazines, or blogs about politics, wearing campaign buttons, posting placards, displaying bumper stickers, giving money to campaigns and organizations, just talking to other people about politics. All of these things seem like they count as political participation, and they don't involve voting. There's a general question here about what it takes to be a good citizen, and you might argue that good citizens vote, but it seems to me that if you do all these other things and you don't vote, you probably still count as a good citizen. Now, voting involves a certain paradox. If you've been following along the material of the course, then you've seen that the material costs of voting tend to vastly outweigh the benefits of voting. That is to say, the odds of your vote making a difference in the outcome of the election, that is to say, your vote actually being breaking a tie or creating a tie, is the odds of that happening are much lower than, say, getting hit by a car on the way to the voting booth. Does that mean that it's irrational to vote? Well, no. Not if you enjoy voting for other reasons, like perhaps you like to feel part of something. Perhaps you enjoy feeling like you did your duty. Perhaps you like expressing yourself in general. You're only being irrational when you vote if you think that your vote affects the outcome in any meaningful way. Similarly, fans who think that cheering in front of the TV or yelling at the TV because the coach made some bad decisions can change the outcome of the game, those fans are probably irrational. That being said, if you enjoy yelling at the TV, then by all means, go ahead and yell at the TV. So what explains participation? Well, political scientists have pondered the question a bunch, but one way to look at this is to take a sort of supply and demand model, right? The supply of participation is going to depend a lot on the availability of organizations in which you can get involved, the availability of polling stations in the case of voting. If there's no polling stations, it's hard to participate. The availability of information and media is also going to help explain the supply of people's participation. Of course, on the demand side, there are the costs of doing all these things, the costs of writing letters, of going to meetings, of contributing. Basically, time and money is going to constrain the demand for political participation. So these supply and demand factors help explain why some people participate more than others. Educated people find it easier to write letters and to contribute to meetings. Wealthier people find it easier to donate money than people who are not so wealthy. Retired people have a lot more time on their hands, and they have a lot more experience participating anyway, and so they can afford to spend a lot of time both acquiring information as well as participating in other ways. So it makes sense that we find that older people, wealthier people, and more educated people participate more than younger, poorer, and less well-educated people. Now, there's always a question in every country about who should be allowed to vote or participate in a country's politics. I remember some years ago now that Bill Clinton got into some hot water because some Chinese businessmen had contributed to his campaign, and people were worried that that meant that China was, in some sense, influencing U.S. policy through campaign contributions. And so Bill Clinton ended up handing back the money that he had received from this Chinese businessman. But more generally, people can be barred for a number of reasons. One is typically concerns about their competence. Right? When we bar criminals from voting, we bar people who are criminally insane or otherwise mentally incapacitated from voting, when we bar children from voting, these are all competence-based concerns. We are worried that they do not have the capacity to cast good votes, and so as a result, we tend to not allow them to vote. And then, of course, there's concerns about national loyalty or their level of investment in the country. So there's people who live in the United States for long periods of time who are not citizens. Non-citizen residents typically don't get to vote because although they are affected by all the decisions that go along, they're not considered members of the political community. They haven't made that commitment of citizenship, so to speak. Now, beyond the question of who should be permitted to participate, there's also an ethical question about how your right to vote should be exercised, right? Given that you have that vote, what should you do with it? Is it the case, for example, that just any vote, including votes for Nazi or communist parties, are okay? Is it okay to vote for anyone as long as you vote? Should some people, perhaps because of a lack of information or education, just stay home? In effect saying, I don't know what the right answer is to this question. You decide. There might be some people whom, if we add their vote to the overall tally of votes, are likely to make the country worse off rather than better off. Is voting even the best way to participate in the system, given how little difference a single vote makes, as we've seen? Again, you're more likely to get hit by a car on the way to the voting station than you are to make a difference with your vote. So perhaps you should focus your efforts on doing something else. Maybe you try to get other people to vote. If you can get 20 people to vote, you'll be making more of a difference than voting yourself. Or perhaps you should write letters to your congressman or contribute money to public interest organizations or to campaigns directly. Maybe all of those things are more likely to make a difference in the long run. And so you should participate in those ways rather than perhaps going to the polls and voting. These are all, I think, important questions about how you should participate and how you should vote. Now, to answer some of these questions, and again, I'm not saying these questions have definite answers, but we can improve our answers by thinking about game theory. Our knowledge of strategic games, in other words, can help us better frame the situation, better understand what situation we're in. Voting is clearly a collective action problem. Good government, that is to say, governing well, is clearly a public good. You benefit from good governance whether you vote or not, and one person's enjoyment of good government doesn't stop anyone else from enjoying it too. So good government is clearly a public good, and moreover, the incentive to free ride, that is to say, to not vote or to vote badly, that is, and by badly here I mean not vote for the candidate I don't happen to like, right? But voting badly means voting without knowing what the issues are, without knowing how government works, or without knowing what the candidates stand for, or even what party they're a member of. All of these things might count as voting badly in the sense that there's no reason to think that your vote is going to bring positive, meaningful information to the overall tally of votes. So the incentive to free ride seems to be pretty high. Again, as you've seen, your individual vote doesn't make much of a difference. But, of course, if everybody thinks that way, then everyone votes, quote-unquote, badly, and we get bad governance, right? And this is very much like other cases of collective action problems, like pollution, right? If I drive my car, or if I drive a Humvee, right, or if I drive a Hummer, you know, the overall level of pollution doesn't change. But if we all drive Hummers, then that's a problem, right? Then the level of pollution is going to change dramatically. If I pour my used motor oil into the Cumberland River, you know, very little happens, right? Very little bad happens. If we all do it, the Cumberland River becomes a dump. Washing your hands during flu season is the same thing, right? If I don't wash my hands, my odds of getting the flu aren't much higher. But if we all don't wash our hands regularly, then it seems like our odds of getting the flu are pretty good. Okay, so there are cases where your individual contribution makes no difference, but if everybody thinks that way and acts that way, then the collective good is not provided. And that's the sort of situation we're in when we're voting. So when we're thinking about solving collective action problems, like we said earlier in the course, there are standard solutions, right? Providing selective incentives, trying to switch the game that you're playing, certain kinds of regulation can help, and of course improving norms of cooperation, even despite people's individual incentives, private incentives not to cooperate. So, selective incentives. Are there ways to provide special benefits to voters that non-voters don't get? If voters get special benefits, then people will be more encouraged to vote. So, for example, you see polling booths distributing "I voted" stickers, right? Presumably, that's a way of gaining a tiny, tiny little bit of status by being able to wear that sticker on election day saying "I voted." Time off work to vote is also a way of giving a special benefit to people who go vote. Of course, if you don't go vote, then you don't get time off work, and so that's a benefit that you can get for voting. Paid time off, obviously. Obviously, giving respect to voters in general and scorn to non-voters. Again, it's a kind of selective incentive. More controversially, you could also reward partisanship. Party members, after all, tend to vote more, take issues more seriously, care more about public affairs, and so you might want to reward membership in political parties by, for instance, subsidizing political party activities or directing government benefits to members of political parties, but not non-members. Now, in fairness, this only solves part of the problem, because although these selective incentives can get people to vote more often, it doesn't make them vote responsibly, and it doesn't make them vote intelligently. The British, for example, used to give college graduates 2 votes. Since the educated already vote more, this could be a way to weight their opinions a little bit more heavily, but of course this comes at the cost of equality. So it doesn't look like selective incentives are really going to do the trick unless you're really willing to make judgments about the quality of people's votes and provide benefits accordingly. Changing the game. Well, changing the game here requires, I guess, getting rid of elections. And getting rid of elections is probably not on the table in the United States. Moreover, it doesn't, just because this game is not as good as it could be, doesn't mean that there's a better one just around the corner. Other systems and other ways of governing seem worse. not better. However, not using democracy in areas where individuals have systematically low knowledge might be a possibility. So in areas where people's votes don't seem to be very meaningful, maybe we don't use voting. So for instance, it might be consistent to use democracy to decide questions about general levels of taxation and redistribution, but not when it comes to very technical questions of public policy, like what kind of tax. Should we have an income tax or a sales tax or a value-added tax or some other kind of tax? Right, how we raise revenue might be a technical question, and the general amount that we raise might be a question that voters are relatively competent about deciding. How much do you want? How much government do you want? The line between what counts as the general direction of policy and the specifics of policy tends to get blurry, however. Right? So on the one hand, it seems like in the abstract we can make that distinction between the general direction of policy and the specific technical aspects of policy, just like it appears in the Army that you can make a distinction between strategy and tactics, right? The broad strategy versus the specific tactics of engagement. But in reality, politicians that are in theory supposed to be determining the overall war aims are also going to get involved in strategy, and generals that are supposed to develop strategy and tactics often also get involved in politics, or at least are tempted to, because the two aren't easily separable in practice. Okay, what about regulation? Are there ways that we could regulate democracy to make it better? Well, certainly if the problem is that it costs too little to vote badly, then you could add something like a poll tax, a fee for voting. So people are paying to exercise their right to vote. Of course, this might mean that low-income people vote less, but at the same time, the education levels, the knowledge levels, and perhaps the civic spiritedness of the voter pool will go up, right? Only people who really care about the issues will bother paying the tax to vote. In a similar vein, some kind of basic political knowledge test, a political knowledge test could be required before you vote, effectively requiring a voting license before you vote. Right? So the government doesn't let you impose risks on other drivers until it makes you pass a test making sure that you can drive at some minimum competence. Why not make sure that voters, before they impose the costs of their political views on others, have some basic knowledge of the relevant facts? Again, it would be a voting license. Now, both these policies risk disenfranchising and marginalizing already marginalized communities. You can imagine that minorities, the poorly educated, and working class folks are less likely to be able to afford the poll tax, and of course are less likely to be able to pass such knowledge tests. And so this is probably, these kinds of regulation are unlikely to be acceptable to a large fraction of the population. And moreover, the history of such measures, however well-intentioned they may be, also suggests that such tests will be applied unfairly and inconsistently and will be used for political goals rather than impartial goals. Right? So like all regulation, the unintended consequences of the regulation are worth pondering, even if in theory they might solve the problem. Okay, norms of cooperation. Well, countries where people take an active interest in public affairs are generally pretty good places to live. Where civic spiritedness is high, quality of governance usually is high. So perhaps the government can find ways to invest in civic spiritedness, not just by encouraging people to vote, but by encouraging them to learn more about public affairs for the sake of the community. The question here is not so much education, as giving people more information, as reinforcing democratic norms. Perhaps finding ways to celebrate thoughtful and responsible participation in the political process, and finding ways to frown upon apathy, but also irresponsible participation, the kind of participation that is neither thoughtful nor responsible. Certainly, this is in practice, this is how many democracies have sustained high levels of quality governance. But I think the question for the American context is, will that work in the United States? Can a highly individualistic culture that we have in the United States, can it bring itself to have the government preach certain kinds of values and norms to citizens, knowing that most American citizens are already pretty resistant to propaganda? So, in conclusion, the bottom line is that if democracy is going to work, a collective action problem has to be overcome, at the ballot box. People have to participate thoughtfully and responsibly in political affairs, even when they have very strong incentives not to, and just free ride off of everyone else. But of course, if everyone free rides, then the quality of our governance suffers. Democracy produces policies that, at best, are wasteful, and at worst, actually harmful to the people who are being governed. If voters are uninformed and do not have a sense of civic responsibility, the risk is that unscrupulous politicians will be able to manipulate the public for their own ends. After all, since the people don't know what's good for them and the people are participating, well, if the people can be manipulated or persuaded that things that are in my interest are actually in their interest, then it seems like the outcome of policy is likely to be somewhat worse. In that kind of scenario, we could still have government by the people, but not for the people. So the fundamental collective action problem at the heart of democratic elections helps us also explain a lot about democratic dysfunction.